Good evening to those of us in the United States. Good morning to our speaker coming to us all the way from Melbourne, Australia. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Thomas Shafee, who is a molecular biologist, but also an information scientist at La Trobe University, and also the founding editor of the WikiJournal of Science. And this workshop tonight, he's going to give us an overview of what is a WikiJournal, and he's going to talk about Wikidata, which is yet another wiki product that the Wikimedia Foundation is supporting. And we're going to spend the bulk of the time actually getting our hands dirty, trying to add stuff and clean stuff up in Wikidata. So big round of applause. Thanking our speaker for literally getting up and coming to us from the other side of the globe. Take it away, Thomas.
Thank you very much. So I appreciate the introduction. So for those of you who haven't met me before, it's great to meet you. My background, as Eric said, is in molecular biology and biochemistry and evolutionary biology. And at the end of my PhD, I started getting heavily into Wikipedia, particularly when writing up my thesis. And the background that I always give for this is that I'd put a huge amount of effort into my thesis introduction in particular, and I'd made some really nice diagrams, and I was doing work on a technique called directed evolution, which is a method of protein engineering. And I noticed that the Wikipedia page on protein engineering, on directed evolution, didn't have any diagrams, and it was very short and not particularly in depth. And I started using my PhD thesis introduction to update the Wikipedia page. And of course, my PhD thesis is read by basically no one. Directed evolution used to be read by about 20,000 people a year. And then directed evolution won a Nobel Prize a couple of years back. And it started getting read by that many people per day instead of per year. So it has vastly greater reach and in many ways greater kind of engagement and impact than particularly a PhD thesis, but even the sorts of publications that I was using. And one of the things that I was always surprised by was the fact that there weren't more, that there was still this kind of divide at the time between academia and Wikipedia, when in many ways you'd expect that they would be projects that would go kind of hand in hand. You know, in many ways they've got very similar goals in terms of knowledge dissemination and sharing. So what I ended up getting involved with was a project called WikiJournals, and I'm just going to do some share screen and bring up a little bit of information on the WikiJournals first, and then I'll introduce Wikidata and then how those two things kind of connect together. Full screen. There we go. Can people see that? Excellent. So when the WikiJournals in concept is running a set of academic journals, but trying to bring into it kind of the lessons learned from what makes Wikipedia work and what makes Wikipedia's sister projects work. And there are already some ideas within that ecosystem that the academic sphere was getting interested in. So Wikipedia has been doing open access for longer than journals have been primarily interested in it, but also in quite an extreme way. So not only is the Wikipedia page open access, but also all of the discussion around it is presented openly. There's a strong focus on the content rather than the author. There's a strong focus on hyper transparency and also micro versioning, so being able to see a complete record of all of the changes to an article so you can see how something looked at any given time. And so initially the first WikiJournal that started up was a WikiJournal of Medicine, and that was started up initially experimentally. and I joined the editorial board of that. And after a couple of years, I proposed making a spin-off journal, the WikiJournal of Science, because realistically, like, I'm not actually really a medical researcher. I'm much more of a basic science researcher, and a lot of the topics that I was really interested in getting people to contribute to fell outside the scope of kind of core medical topics. So WikiJournal of Science started up, and then WikiJournal of Humanities started up, and all three of them share a preprint server where articles are drafted whilst they're being worked on. But effectively, there's kind of three core tenets that sit underneath this. The first one is the transparency and openness in terms of doing things like public peer review. Also, obviously, they are open access journals. They're not sitting behind a paywall. And also, we were very keen on making them also publication charge free to avoid the additional problems that come when you put an article processing fee up front, where it ends up excluding a lot of potential contributors. And so the fact that authors typically write for free and peer reviewers typically review for free, we built these journals assuming that the editors and people involved in it would also do that editorial work for free. That's evolved somewhat since then, and I'll talk in a moment about some of the ways in which we're trying to help support particularly the technical editor staff. But that's kind of the basics of where the WikiJournals came from. And I think one of the useful things to understand is the flexibility and variety that allows you to actually achieve using this MediaWiki software that Wikipedia is built on, and having some level of integration with Wikipedia and other projects. So on the one side, you've got standalone articles, and this is probably the section that is most typical to other academic journals, right? You've got research articles and case studies, teaching methodology journals, systematic reviews. We've also published image galleries, and this has been particularly useful when there have been science illustrators or medical illustrators who have a big back catalogue of images that they ended up making for clients and not using, or they put together and didn't end up disseminating very widely, or they've used once behind paywalls, but they'd actually like to be able to expose these openly, but also, clearly license them and get a DOI attached so that they can get them cited. But in addition to these sorts of standalone articles, the other nice thing that a WikiJournal allows is greater integration with the rest of the Wikipedia and Wikimedia ecosystem. So in terms of Wikipedia, I'll just quickly introduce the quality scale that Wikipedia pages have. So all the way down at the bottom, you've got stub and start class articles, and then it goes through CB and then good article and featured article. Good article and featured article within Wikipedia have to go through an internal pseudo, well, I guess it's not peer review, it's more like an editorial review process where other non-involved editors will go through and check the quality of those pages. So they represent less than 1%, and in the case of featured article, less than 0.1% of all Wikipedia articles. But there are ways in which WikiJournal contributors can affect all of those different article levels within Wikipedia. So for articles that are completely absent or a stub or start class, a WikiJournal article can essentially just create one de novo and overwrite any, like a paragraph or two of content that's already there. So an example of that was on this drug class of anthracyclines, which was previously, I think, a 3-sentence Wikipedia article and is now a really nicely fleshed out article. Then there's this middle ground, which in some ways is the most tricky, where there's already an established Wikipedia article that may be 3,000 words long, but it's outdated. Maybe it was basically written in 2005 and hasn't really been updated since then. Or maybe it's flawed because it focuses entirely on one area and not another. So for example, I think the old lysine article focused entirely on production of lysine by bacteria, but not production of lysine by plants. And plants is where we as humans get most of our dietary lysine. So there were clearly like significant gaps in that. And so again, the WikiJournal article which was a review article about lysine, ended up replacing the majority of that content. And then finally, we get into these top class articles, featured articles and good articles. And interestingly, these ones have actually been submitted straight from Wikipedia to the journal. So the journals treat Wikipedia as a valid preprint server. And so the existing Wikipedia articles on peripatric speciation and the Rosetta Stone were submitted from Wikipedia to the WikiJournals so that we could then put those through academic external peer review and draw that information back into Wikipedia after a stable, citable version of record was published. And then finally, we've got some interesting kind of middle ground options where there have been articles where sections of them have become sections of a Wikipedia page. So for example, there was an article about gene structure in one of the WikiJournals where it became a section of the Wikipedia page about genes. And similarly, a WikiJournal article about cell disassembly during apoptosis had sections of it integrated into the Wikipedia article on apoptosis. And the final kind of thing in this category is partner articles. And this is something that hasn't been explored to a great depth yet, but I think has a lot of scope, where Wikipedia is written for the broadest possible audience. There's obviously scope for more technical partner articles that can go alongside them. And so an example of that was there's a Wikipedia page about dioxins, and there's a WikiJournal page about dioxins and dioxin-like compounds that goes into like 20,000 words worth of detail on the topic, and was essentially an author who had written a book on dioxins and dioxin-like compounds that, of course, he had to hand over the copyright for and is behind a paywall. And he was annoyed that there wasn't any open access option. And so he basically paraphrased his own book almost in its entirety and submitted it as this partner article that got published in WikiJournal of Science. So just to give you a brief history of how this kind of all came about, I just want to note that it's not just the WikiJournals who have been experimenting in this field, and actually early experimentation goes all the way back to 2008. So the first that I know of is the journal RNA Biology started requiring authors who published on a new RNA gene family to also create a Wikipedia page if a Wikipedia page did not yet exist, or update the Wikipedia page on that gene family if there was already an article on it. And that was followed up, I think, by the next big innovation, which was from PLOS Computational Biology, that started publishing what they called topic pages as a review format. And this was essentially very much what I've been talking about in the previous slide, where an author is asked, write something in a Wikipedia style and submit it to PLOS Computational Biology. We'll publish it in PLOS Computational Biology, and then we'll copy it over into Wikipedia. The restriction in this case is that it had to not exist at all in Wikipedia at the time. Nowadays, they also accept accept articles that are on Wikipedia stubs and start class articles, but they steer well clear of anything where there's already a Wikipedia page of C class or above, because they don't because from their point of view, they're more interested in something moving into Wikipedia in its entirety rather than kind of integrating in. Soon after in 2013, Gene started up what was called Gene Wiki Reviews. And Gene is the first subscription paywalled journal on this list to try experimenting with that. And so, of course, this is another interesting situation where they're not going to put the entirety of an article that was in the journal Gene over into Wikipedia because it's sitting behind a paywall. So what they actually had was have people write two totally separate articles at the same time, one that went into the journal and a totally separate one that went into Wikipedia, but they both got peer reviewed together and then disseminated to the different directions. And then the first example of a Wikipedia page being put through peer review by an existing journal was the Wikipedia page on dengue fever was submitted to the journal Open Medicine. put through peer review and then updates integrated into Wikipedia. And so WikiJournal of Medicine starts up in 2014, basically inspired largely by that OpenMed example. And then after that, you've just got expansion of the existing formats. So PLOS Genetics joins PLOS Computational Biology, and then WikiJournal of Science and WikiJournal of Humanities start up. So to clarify, there have been these kind of three major models, either the journal first model, like the PLOS journals do, where the article goes into the journal first and then gets copied into Wikipedia. There's the Wikipedia first model that Open Medicine pioneered, and then the WikiJournals have also taken up as one of the unique selling points that the journals also do, where the article, where the page is first written and established in Wikipedia, sometimes over decades, and then gets submitted to the journal, published and reintegrated into Wikipedia. And then there's that parallel model that Gene kind of necessarily has to do because it's a subscription journal, and RNA Biology chose to do, partly because it was an early pioneer in the field, where articles are submitted to the journal and then something separate is also in parallel submitted into Wikipedia. And these have their own pros and cons that I'm not going to go into in particular detail because it's a little bit beside the point at the moment. But the main thing is that I don't think that these are competing models with each other. And the WikiJournals, for example, do all three of these. And I think it's that flexibility, the flexibility of picking and choosing between these different ways of doing it that is actually a strength. And so for the Wikipedia, the fully Wikipedia integrated examples, it's always useful just to see what that vaguely looks like. So here's here's one of the, I think the first example from PLOS Computational Biology. Here's what it looked like in the journal, so circular permutation in proteins. Here's the exact same content as the Wikipedia page, circular permutation in proteins. It started off in 2012 being all the same images and all the same text. And of course, in the last 8 years, although the journal article has remained static, the Wikipedia page has continued to evolve as new examples have come up, new information has become available, additional models have been used. And down in the references section of that Wikipedia page, they essentially both link to each other. So the version in the article says content from this was integrated into Wikipedia, and the Wikipedia page says this article is based on content from this this Wikipedia page is based on content from this journal article. And so the WikiJournals have set up this kind of publishing flow, right? And this is very similar in many ways to other academic journals where these days, often journals are very pro preprint servers. You know, for example, SocArchive and the Social Sciences Research Network and the OSF and Zenodo and all of these various preprint servers. The WikiJournals host their own preprint server because it makes it easier to move content around when it's all written in MediaWiki, and particularly with the advent of what's called the visual editor interface for wikis, it's made editing a wiki page similar in difficulty to editing a Google Doc or a Word document. The peer review process is all performed in public. So all of the comments are publicly viewable, all of the author responses are publicly viewable, and about 75% of peer reviewers also agree to reveal their identities during the process as well. And one of the things that I'm keen on in the future is having reviewers instead of being perpetually anonymous, instead having their identities merely embargoed for some period of time, because I think that it is pretty unreasonable for the sort of academic scholarly corpus to have that kind of hidden information in perpetuity. I mean, there are secrets about nuclear submarines that are becoming declassified from the 80s, and yet journal articles from 10 years before that, you can't find out who the peer reviewers were or what the peer reviewer comments were. Let's say the, I don't know, the Wakefield MMR causes autism. What were the peer reviewer comments like on that? Were they in depth? I don't know. I'd hope not, because apparently some serious stuff got slipped through the cracks. But it would be interesting to know, at the very least, the peer reviewer comments, even let alone eventually the peer reviewer identities. And then finally, I think the key to all of this is being able to clearly publish in a way that is compatible with current academic practices. So in particular, a PDF so that people can store a copy themselves, an HTML version in order to take advantage of that digital native capabilities, where you can embed videos, you can embed code, you can include sortable tables, those sorts of things. And finally, attaching the DOIs so that we're clear when we're citing a version of an article, what version are we citing, even if there are multiple versions of that article out there. There was the preprint version before it got accepted, and then there was the version that existed after peer review, and then maybe 5 years later the authors want to go back and update that, particularly let's say if it's a systematic review. There a lot can happen in 5 years. They want to update their systematic review, again being clear which version we're talking about and updating a new DOI. But of course, content can get integrated into Wikipedia and its sister projects to take advantage of that kind of broad readership and have that continuously updatable, evolving version. And as I previously mentioned, Wikipedia itself can be treated as a valid source of preprints. And because Wikipedia is at the start and end of this process, there's no problem with versioning, or in fact, even omitting Wikipedia as the start and end point of this process. I'm quite keen on the idea of versioning journal articles in the same way that we version textbooks. I mean, Molecular Biology of the Cell, which was one of the core textbooks that people were using when I did my undergraduate. When I did my undergraduate, we were already on version 5 of the textbook, and I think version 7 is coming out now. And it's completely accepted that, this textbook is evolving slowly from year to year, decade to decade, and that's totally understandable. The information changes, and we don't need to completely rename the textbook and have a totally different author set and have it published by a different publisher and have them kind of pretend to be different things. They're clearly different versions of the same thing. And similarly, there's a prolific author in my own field who publishes on a type of protein called cyclotides, and he and his research group publish once a year a review article on the same topic, to the point where they are running out of unique titles to call it. There's cyclotides, structure and function, the structure and function of cyclotides, structure, usage and function of cyclotides, cyclotides and their uses and structures and functions. And pretty much every combination of that. And really what they really should be doing is calling something like one title and then just clearly versioning it, and then all of those versions will point backwards and forwards through the chain, so that when you're looking at an article, is this the most recent version of that same review article that they always publish? And I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that that can be done pretty broadly, particularly for review articles, but even for research articles, when you come to a particular conclusion and then 5 years later a whole load of other research has come out that makes you reevaluate your same results in a different light, and you go, I see the conclusion that I drew. Actually, I want to modify that. I'll tell you what, I can annotate my own articles. I could add an addendum to the end of my article and have it not be a big deal, and just publish an updated version with a new DOI after it's been rechecked by peer reviewers. And so I'm going to now pivot over to the Wikidata side of things, because I think that this has given some idea of why the WikiJournal system as a way of publishing is quite an interesting way of doing an academic journal. It allows you to host a journal on a free platform. It allows you to do very low cost academic publishing in what's called a diamond open access model, where the expectation is that there's no required cost for readers, and there's no required cost for authors either. And it also allows a lot of flexibility and interesting things that you can do with integrating with other parts of that knowledge ecosystem, particularly if you're interested in getting a message out to the broadest possible audience. So that's a logical kind of starting pause point before I jump into Wikidata and kind of we start to do some interactive stuff. So I'm just going to quickly check the chat log, but feel free to interrupt with any kind of questions that have come up at this point.
Every time I hear you talk, you blow my mind at least 3 times in 10 minutes. And I've heard you talk a couple times. We have a bunch of shout outs and comments in the chat. I haven't seen any questions. Dr. Steve Evans at Ohio University and I have been talking about the idea of versioning an article like we version textbooks as being potentially a really neat fit with practice guidelines and parameters. And I dropped a link to the Google Doc in the chat and just realized that I should we have some people that this is their first Thursday coming. So the link to the Google Doc is, we're using it as a combination of notes and also dropping links to resources. So we've got Dr. Shafee has put both sets of slides in there, also links to several preprints and reprints, which of course are all open access. The slides are both decks are CC by 4.0, which means that you're allowed to share them with other people. You're allowed to use them in your own teaching. What Dr. Shafee asks is just an attribution saying these slides came from a cool talk by Dr. Shafee. A couple of you have heard one of the things that I want to loop back to at the end is just sort of talking about ways that psychology might get involved with this and how different articles and chapters and things that we're doing might fit with the WikiJournal model. Other questions that people?
Eric, this is Steve. I have a question.
Yes, please.
And there was a comment relevant to this and just showed up in the chat, but I first, thanks for doing this presentation. This is interesting. I appreciate the being able to hear you talk about this. The one point that I wasn't sure about was you talked about making identities of reviewers public. And that's one that certainly would stir the pot a bit. But I wonder to what end, like what is the value to science or the dissemination of science, knowing that Eric was a reviewer on one of my articles and this is what he said about it?
Yeah, so I think that there's from my point of view, there's a few things that I think are useful to it. One of them is for, I guess, auditability. If I've got an article and I am wondering, wait, did this just get softballed through review? It can be useful to be able to see, oh no, this was reviewed by people who know what they're talking about. It was reviewed by a couple of people who are genuinely in the field, particularly with the rise of predatory publishers. And from the comments point of view, again, checking like if I've spotted something that I think is an issue, was this brought up, or were both of the reviews, like 2 sentences long of, yep, I reckon that this was fine. So I think that there's some usefulness just kind of in the transparency and auditability of that backlog, and also for I guess detecting conflict of interest. So one of the things that there was a really nice publication on a while back was about reciprocal reviewing arrangements. If person A is always reviewing person B's papers and person B is always reviewing person A's papers, that's not a conflict of interest in terms of a monetary issue, but it is something that is still noteworthy. And even the cases where, well, a reviewer is actually an ex-PhD student of this particular, of a particular author, is also useful to know about, again, in that kind of COI sort of a way. So one of the things that I think, even with anonymous reviewers, it can still be useful to indicate information about that reviewer, which again is typically not done. But one example might be, this is an anonymous reviewer. However, they work in the field of, genetics of bipolar disorder, and they have both a PhD and an MD. Something like that is very useful, particularly when an article is multidisciplinary. And if it touches on, let's say, I don't know, genetics as well as pharmacology, but you've only had pharmacologists as reviewers, it's useful to know that actually there's possibly a gap, that actually the genetics aspects of it pretty much weren't looked at because the reviewers didn't have skills in that area.
And a point of clarification, listening to this and thinking about it, my understanding of the current policy with the WikiJournals is that anonymous review is a possibility. It's not a requirement to disclose, and there isn't a set embargo period. That's like an interesting idea or interesting discussion, but not a. So to Steve's point of, if people already are hesitant about trying a new format or medium, this is not a barrier to entry of, oh, PS, and one more thing, everything you do will be public forever, forever, forever.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a question in the chat of like, what kind of time are we talking about for this kind of identity embargo? I mean, I really don't know, and I actually don't know of any journals that do this currently. So this is a completely, to the best of my knowledge, completely thought experiment. My guess would be something of the order of 30 years, which means that either if you were a vulnerable early career researcher, and one of the benefits of protecting reviewer anonymity is that you avoid retaliation against negative reviews by early career researchers, by established researchers. So 30 years allows an ECR to either by then be an established researcher and less vulnerable to that sort of retaliation, or they've left the field entirely and it kind of doesn't matter. Or for an established researcher, they've retired and it's not going to affect their career at all. So I would guess if you're talking about embargoes, you're talking of the order of 30, 40 years probably, to kind of avoid any potential problems.
Following up on my question then, what's the point? In 40 years, you won't know who that person was or if they had any expertise to begin with.
Yeah, no, I do see what you're saying there. I guess part of it is having been involved in some of the meta research communities, so people who research the process of research. One of the things that they struggle with is the incompleteness of the total data set. And this kind of move towards increasingly doing science increasingly open in kind of an open kitchen analogy. So, you know, you go to a pizza restaurant and you see the pizza being made. The analogy being you can trying to do the open kitchen of science to increase partly public understanding of science, but also public trust in science, that it's not some magical process. You can see, you know, you can see the food being made in the open kitchen of science, of this is what's going on behind the scenes. And I think that reviewer identities can be a part of that. I don't think it's the whole thing. I feel as though reviewer comments are probably more valuable than reviewer identities as a whole, but I still think that reviewer identities is quite important. And I think the early WikiJournals, particularly early on, did it as a way of legitimizing, because let's assume that you see WikiJournal of Medicine and your initial assumption is, okay, well, this is probably a whole load of people, you know, like misorganizing peer reviews, getting non-experts to review things. I don't trust the process. The point is, well, okay, we're going to reveal as much information as people are happy to reveal in order to allow people to come to their own conclusions of how thorough that process was, and hopefully appreciate, okay, no, this was a pretty thorough process.
So do you think, like, in general, that if people view that the reviews are mostly anonymous, no matter like the actual value of the reviews, do you think a lot of people would just kind of dismiss that article because of that?
I mean, I don't think that that's particularly the case, and I mean, it's clearly not the case in general, right? Because most journals do both anonymous reviewers and confidential reviews. But so I don't think that it inevitably leads to that, but I think it means that you don't have to rely on the reputation of the journal as a whole, and it can also mean that you can build reputation on an article by article basis rather than a journal by journal basis, because also journals change over time. And some journals have improved over time. Like there are certainly some MDPI journals and some Frontiers journals that started off being, to be honest, pretty dodgy, and have improved over time, and vice versa. There are some journals that after a turnover in the editorial board went markedly downhill.
It looks like Dr. Fritz is raising his hand very politely.
I try. I guess I could start my video, although no one wants to see my face. First off, yeah, I'm a big fan of the open source movement and the open science and the badging and things. I think there's a lot of potential there. You know, as someone who gets asked to review on a daily basis for no money for, you know, articles that sometimes I know what it is about, sometimes I don't, and I try not to review things I don't know anything about. But from, you know, lots and lots of journals, you know, there's a major issue with the implementation of these types of things, right? Because the open science is based on everybody giving 110% and doing everything in 2 weeks. And I mean, you know, let's be honest, I, you know, am lucky when I can get a review done that's only 2 weeks after the 6 weeks they gave me, because it had to get in the queue. And so, you know, in addition to the fact that academia as a whole currently is not rewarding any of this, any of the things you're talking about, and possibly in psychology, you know, possibly in some of the other fields in medicine they are, but in psychology they're not. And so, you know, I see some major impediments to these things, and admittedly it's a cultural change, and maybe all of the current students are gonna, you know, by the time they're mid-career faculty like me, everything will be great. I'm not gonna hold my breath on it. And so, you know, I would be curious, just, you know, what do we need to start implementing now to actually make this a reality in 30 to 40 years, assuming we're all still doing this in 30 to 40 years?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is also happening on the grander scale. So if you've heard of Plan S and DORA, I think that those are two parts of the puzzle. So Plan S is on the funder side of things, with basically funders saying, hey, we're funding all of this research, and then it's getting published behind paywalls. That seems like something's gone wrong there. And so a whole load of funders have signed up to Plan S, mostly Europe, but a few North American ones, my understanding is, and certainly some of the international ones like Wellcome, Bill and Melinda Gates, that sort of crowd have signed up to it, saying like, if we fund your research must be published open access immediately. No embargoes, no paywalls, no nothing. It goes in, either it's going in a the current wording of Plan S is it goes in an open access, a gold open access journal, or you pay the article processing fee to a hybrid open access journal to at least have it being an open access article in an otherwise closed journal. And the updated version of Plan S that is being voted on sometime early next year is actually removing that loophole as well, and saying like, no, it has to just go in a gold open access journal. We don't want anything published in any paywall journal of any sort, hybrid or not. So that's kind of the funder side of the like the stick, I guess. And also on the carrot side, DORA is the Declaration on Open Research Assessment, I think, which is something that universities sign up to, which is basically saying, as part of our tenure track programs and hiring decisions and promotion decisions and blah, 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 we're not just counting the number of citations that you get. We're not just counting your H-index. We're not just counting your total number of publications and the impact factor of the journals, but we're also taking into account how open your research is, whether you've done, whether you do non-technical summaries for your research, whether you've got evidence that you're attempting to get broader engagement with your research outside of academia and have it either translated directly into practice and policy and whatever, or being kind of, or at the very least have a pathway to impact where it's shared and disseminated to the community. So there's kind of some of those very broad things that are happening. But I also think there's a lot of stuff that's just happening on a journal by journal basis. And there's a lot of information about existing subscription journals and how it's possible to flip a journal open access, and particularly like the funding side of things. And bear in mind, I have very little experience with anything on the funding side of things, because the only journals I've worked with are PLOS, which has always been open access and has always charged article processing fees. But for topic pages, it gives a fee waiver, so it doesn't charge people to publish topic page articles when they go into Wikipedia. And the WikiJournals, which don't charge authors or readers, and is entirely supported by a charitable foundation, the Wikimedia Foundation. So I can't speak particularly to kind of the funding issues around open science and open knowledge, but I think the cultural issues are kind of eminently addressable. One of the things that I think actually is going to be part of the sticking point as things progress is actually kind of the fear factor of openness. And this, I mean, this was even kind of a sticking point when people were talking about releasing data sets early on. Firstly, like the fear factor of releasing your data set so that someone can try and perform the same statistical analyses, and you better hope that they get the same p value that you did, otherwise there's going to be egg on your face. But also, well, what do we do with sensitive data then? I mean, I'm working with a data set that involves the medical records of 10,000 diabetes patients and their treatment and their outcomes. Like, how can that be made open? And so the discussions around, well, how do we de-identify data to make it safe to share? How do we make that future-proofed so that it doesn't accidentally become re-identifiable in the future as new information becomes available? How do we redact unstructured data in a way that is safe but also retains utility? So a lot of those sorts of things kind of also come into the picture, and I think that there's a lot on the side of open peer review and open peer review identities that fits in with that. But one of the things you mentioned about reviewers not getting credit, I have peer reviewed for journals where the journal didn't even know that I did it. It was my supervisor who was asked to be the peer reviewer, and my supervisor said, hey, Thomas, this would be a really great experience for you to get some practice in at peer reviewing. You do the peer review, I'll have a look at it, and then I'll submit it up to the journal. But at no point in that process did my supervisor at the time tell the journal that it wasn't her doing the peer review, that it was me. And I think that one of the things that, again, can be useful is, you know what, just be open about it. Say the peer reviewer that was contacted was the eminent famous Dr. Smith, but they also got a PhD student, Ms. Lang, and a postdoc, Dr. whatever, to also assist on this peer review, and you just indicate that all up front as to who is who's contributing.
I do mentored reviews with my students. I make it a stipulation of doing the review for the journal, so the journals never say no, and it's a joint review. So yeah, that's I view the other way around as unethical. So
yeah, and I agree. I think that was a culture, that also might be a culture difference and a culture change, because that was definitely pretty standard practice at some of the labs that I've worked in. But also the cultures can be so markedly different in different fields that it can be a bit of a surprise. Like, I hadn't come across double-blinded peer review until relatively recently, but it's standard in the humanities that it would be really weird for the reviewers to know the author names during peer review. But also vice versa in mathematics, it's really weird to have anything hidden at all. So they've been doing open peer review for ages. They've been doing preprints for like since the 50s or something ridiculous. And they've been doing kind of this idea that you would have a preprint up and then you'd have people commenting on that, just like anyone, a free-for-all to comment on that preprint for years maybe, before it eventually makes its way into a journal and you get that kind of stable version that finally gets published. So an article might end up having 20 effective peer reviewers and 2 official peer reviewers at that final hurdle, who will have taken into account the 20 or so preliminary peer reviews that have been spontaneously submitted to the preprint version of that article.
Well, so that's I will ask one more thing and then I'll shut my mouth so that other people can ask. I mean, I see that as potentially a really good thing about some of the open source stuff, is to sort of say 2 rounds of reviews, 3 reviewers, accept or not accepted, because, you know, it varies so much journal to journal. I've had things go through 7 or 8 full rounds of reviews with 10 different reviewers, at which point it's like, you know, what's the point?
Yeah.
You know, it's you had the initial reviews. And so, you know, that's my only concern about some of this stuff about, well, you know, you didn't get a molecular biologist on this. We better get one of those now. Oh, well, you know what? I know there's a guy in political science and that has impact, that we better get a political scientist on this. And it's like, okay, more is not always better. You know, so I mean, I think that's an issue. And I will say that I've heard of some people going the other way, paying reviewers, because you get paid $50 per review, you will get it done in 2 weeks, it'll get done, you'll do a good job because you're getting paid. And, you know, it puts some responsibility behind it. Now for that, you know, feel free to disagree, but at the same time, I'd probably get my reviews in a lot faster if I was being paid.
Yeah.
I think I just wanted to say that so I'm in a neuroscience lab, and for instance, my PI had to write a grant proposal that outlined ways that she was going to disseminate her work to the non-scientific community. And then one of the graduate students in my class or in my lab also received a grant on the condition that the stimuli he was producing would be on a open access platform. And so I helped him put it on OSF. And so I think that there are funding sources that are moving towards oh, you want this money? Okay, well then you need to tell us how you're going to disseminate this to like stakeholders or people in the public and whatnot. And so I also sent an article in the chat that also goes into a little bit more depth about that and about barriers that you're talking about for scientists to share and disseminate.
Can you drop that on the Google Doc, please?
Oh yeah. How do I drop a PDF on a Google Doc?
Probably just the if there's a DOI or a
yes,
version of it online.
I'll drop. I didn't realize it was the whole PDF. I'll put that. It's open.
I don't remember, but I can check and then let you know.
Okay, cool.
So what I'll do at this juncture, I reckon, is let's go back into some shared screen, and we're going to I'll introduce you to the concept of Wikidata, and we'll do a little bit of actual interactivity. So share screen.
We missed one question in the comments.
Oh, pardon me, go ahead.
Wilson said, what are the differences between a paywalled journal article and the same journal article reprinted for WikiJournal?
Okay, interesting. So typically when paywalled content, for paywalled journals, you have to sign over your copyright ownership of all of the information to that journal. It's part of the reason why postprints or author-accepted manuscripts are quite important to what's called green open access, because by putting up basically a version of that same content that is not behind that paywall, you're able to retain copyright to a version that you can then work with and do things with. So by putting things up on on a Wikimedia platform, it kind of satisfies that requirement for having an open repository deposited version of it. But the one of the differences between having a paywall journal article and the same article reprinted for WikiJournal is that in some cases, those articles are actually quite different. So I think that one of the examples I gave was that dioxins article, which was actually a book chapter originally, but book chapters are pretty much inevitably paywalled. There are very few open access scientific book publishers. But it allowed that author to make a version of it that everyone was able to read, rather than just the people who had access to that book. Because even just the book chapter, I think to read that book chapter was $60, let alone the book itself being a few hundred. And so it's also just a case of, I guess, making the most out of the work that you've already done.
That's good to know. I thought it was a more detrimental difference for the Wikipedia version in some way.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I would say that the version in WikiJournal, one of the benefits is being able to point to a stable version. So WikiJournal articles have a DOI associated with an accepted version, and the Wikipedia article, the Wikipedia copy evolves over time and means that it's able to get updated. So like that example with the circular permutation in proteins, the downside is that that Wikipedia article might decrease in quality over time, which does sometimes happen. But in general, Wikipedia articles increase in quality and coverage over time. And it also avoids the situation where a new and important aspect of a topic is discovered but is completely missing from a journal article.